What is going on, everybody? It's Brad with DFS City. College football season is officially back, and with that being said, I wanted to make a quick video sharing some of the notes that I've taken over the past few years playing college football DFS. Now, I'm not going to sit here and toot my own horn and claim that I'm some sort of professional with the best picks. This is not a slate preview by any means. I'm not out here playing thousands of dollars every slate. However, college football fantasy is probably my best fantasy sport. I've been in the top 5% of all players the past couple of seasons, and I feel like I have some useful information if you're new to this format. So, without further ado, let's get started. I'm just going to talk about each position and basically what you should be looking for and how you should be drafting your lineups. Let's get into it. So, just a quick breakdown here before I actually dive into each position. The way that college football fantasy works is you'll have your quarterback, two running backs, three wide receivers, a flex, and a super flex. So, there's no tight ends, there's no defense. Kind of makes things interesting, and it's almost like you're playing a dual QB league. So, we'll start with the quarterbacks. Your first goal should be to identify safe, and I put that in parentheses, safe high upside quarterbacks. You shouldn't be scared of these pay up options because typically, when you're paying up for one of these quarterbacks on DraftKings at least, they are some of the better options on the slate. Now, of course, we're coming up on week one right now. We just had week 0 last week. So DraftKings hasn't really adjusted to the season yet, and quite frankly, we don't really have a lot of information so far, and that's perfectly fine. But just going forward, just remember that. Don't be scared to pay up for some of these options. Next point to touch on here is rushing upside is important. So, of course, this goes without saying, but rushing yards accumulate a lot of fantasy points. We're talking 10 rushing yards is 1 fantasy points as opposed to 25 passing yards being 1 fantasy point. Next thing, who can get the 300-yard passing bonus? This is huge on DraftKings, and it's not a thing on FanDuel, so you don't have to worry about it over there. However, there are a lot of quarterbacks in college football that can get that 300-yard passing bonus. That's 3 extra fantasy points, and that could go a long way. Who, in parentheses, if anyone, can get the 100-yard rushing bonus? Now, this won't be as common for quarterbacks as it is for running backs. However, there are some quarterbacks out there that will be very mobile. If they do have a good matchup where the opposing defense is weak against the rush, then they might actually get that 100-yard rushing bonus. And if you pair that with the 300-yard passing bonus, we're talking a huge fantasy score. Next thing, matchups are important. Blowouts can change the script. Now, what you want to do is look at the betting lines because in college football, you'll have some very lopsided matchups. You might have a spread that's, 31-point favorite, and if that's the case, you have to think to yourself, if this team is up 49-0 in the fourth quarter, are they really going to be passing the ball? Is that starter even going to be in the game? These are things you have to consider because it could very well affect your lineup. 95+% of the time, you'll be playing dual QB with a QB in the Superflex, and we'll touch more on this later. All right, now moving on to running backs, and this is one of my favorite slides here. I like to always focus on the bell cow running backs. So basically, what that means is which offenses are relying on that guy that gets 20 to 30 carries every game. Think Bijan Robinson last year. There's a reason why he's so touted in the NFL right now, going in the first round in most drafts. He was getting 20 to 30 carries every game, had the receiving upside, and was likely to fall in the box 1 to 2 times a game. And we're talking 30 plus fantasy points a game. He was almost a stone cold lock every time he was on the slate. The 100-yard rushing bonus is money. So, typically there's going to be quite a few guys that are able to do this in college football. You want to look for those guys that are getting fed and can get you that 100-yard rushing bonus. That's 3 extra fantasy points, and it could go a long way. PPR scoring on DK, of course, you want to look for receiving upside. If you have guys that are just, complete production monsters, they're getting fed with the handoffs and they're getting receptions, then that's even better. Then we got perspective. So 1 reception for 6 yards is equivalent to 16 rushing yards. If a guy's averaging 4 yards per carry, it's going to take him 4 carries to get those 16 rushing yards. However, if he's also getting, 5 to 6 receptions a game, it might be a screen pass out of the backfield for 6 yards. That's already 1.6 fantasy points. You factor in the rushing yards on top of that, and you got more fantasy production. Fading split backfields is often a good idea. So I talked about the bell cow backs. That's what you want to focus on. If you have a committee where it's like 2 to 3 running backs that are sharing the snaps, it's typically a bad idea to focus on those guys because you just don't know where the workload is going to be. Now, of course, as the season progresses, you might have a better idea. But in my opinion, with all the options out there, and there will be a handful of bell cow backs, you just want to focus on them. So next we got wide receivers, which I think is the most volatile position in all of college football DFS. Tight ends are wrapped into wide receivers, so that makes it a little bit more interesting. But nonetheless, target share is extremely important here. You could either break this down by percentage, or you could look at targets per game. Personally, I like to look at targets per game over the course of a larger sample size because it just gives you more clarity. And of course, you could look at injuries too. Just think of alpha receivers, star power, like I have in the next bullet point, i.e., Marvin Harrison. These are guys that are going to be trying to show out every game for their draft stock. And who can get that 100-yard receiving bonus? That's another 3 points there. This will probably be a little bit less likely to come by as opposed to the 100-yard rushing bonus for running backs. But there are some guys that will be putting up 100 yards receiving every game. You just have to keep an eye on it and find out who those players are going to be. Then we got matchups. This is similar to the quarterback situation. If a blowout is likely, receivers from the favored team are likely to see fewer targets. Of course, they'll probably run the ball to kill the clock. They don't want to be assholes to the other team. So you know how that goes. I would probably avoid wide receivers in those matchups. And then red zone looks are of course important. A receiving touchdown is 6 fantasy points. Once we have a larger sample size, we'll be able to see who exactly is getting those red zone looks for certain teams, and you'll definitely want to take that into consideration. Then moving on to the most interesting positions in college football DFS, we'll start with the flex and then move on to the super flex. In my opinion, for the flex, and of course you don't have to take this into account, however, I think it's always best to focus on 3 running back builds, which means you'll want a running back in the flex spot most of the time. So lineups are automatically higher upside when you have 3 bell cow backs in the lineup. You don't have to avoid wide receivers by any means, but they are more volatile. You can't bank on some guy getting 10 targets a game and actually catching all 10 of those targets. So the reason for running backs in this position in college football is that the workload is pretty much guaranteed for a handful of backs. There will be a few guys that have a safe floor and a high ceiling based on projected workload alone. So lastly, we got the superflex position, which I see as the most interesting position in all of college football, because quite frankly, there's just too many people that don't play a second QB here. And it makes sense. I'm not going to tell you what exactly to do. It is feasible to put a running back there. You could even put a wide receiver there. Like I said, I'm not here to tell you what to do, but it does make the most sense to have a QB there most of the time. They're guaranteed to touch the ball all game, as I put in that first bullet point. And, when somebody's touching the ball all game, it pretty much just gives them more chance to accumulate fantasy points. It's common sense. I put running backs are feasible if it's a bad QB slate, and that's definitely true. There is a path to doing 4 bell cow backs, and it really just depends on the slate. Wide receivers are probably the riskiest option, but that doesn't mean it can't be optimal. Of course, anything could happen if you're playing in these large field GPPs with 15,000 people. You might just have the one lucky guy that just happens to put a wide receiver there that breaks the slate, and there's nothing you could do about it. But most often, you're going to see a QB there, and every now and then you will see a running back there from my personal experience. When you do run a dual QB, as I said, every offensive play provides another opportunity for fantasy points. The same can't be said about wide receivers and running backs, as they don't take the snaps. So that's all for this one, guys. Like I said, just a quick run through of some notes that I put together. You don't have to take my advice. Quite frankly, I don't care if you do. I will not be doing slate previews or picks throughout the season or anything. But every now and then I will try and put out these helpful videos where I see fit, just to try and help you guys out a little bit. So if you enjoyed this video, please make sure you're subscribed to the channel. I make content just covering every sport as I see fit. And appreciate you guys watching. Appreciate all the support lately. This has been Brad with DFS City, and we'll see you in the next one.